Great. Oh, excuse me. It is about 5:30 p.m. here, and I am James Preswich, and this is Breaking Down Bridges. I'm going to wait until someone confirms they can hear me, and then keep going with the presentation. Oof. So I understand this conference has been running basically all day, and I am towards the end, so I'm going to try to keep this close to time and not run over too much so we can keep going about our days. Perfect. Someone confirmed they can hear me. So my name is James Preswich. I work at Celo as a protocol engineer, and that means that I do a lot of bike shedding consensus systems. Before working at Celo, I co-founded a company called Summa, and we worked on cross-chain interoperability projects with Celo, the Interchain Foundation, and a number of other prominent chains and companies in the space. My goals for this talk, our agenda for today, is I'm going to start by briefly talking about Celo, and then work into an intuitive understanding of bridges, the communication authentication models that underpin them, and I forgot to finish the slide, so we'll just see what happens after that. So throughout this talk, we're going to be using pretty much standard flowchart notation. So the rounded rectangles are the start and stop states. The rectangles with hard corners are the process. Parallelograms are inputs and outputs. Diamonds are decisions. For brevity, I've omitted a bunch of the diamond whiskers. So if you see a diamond with only one outgoing whisker, just assume that it means everything falls apart and we don't get a bridge today. Okay, so we have this intuitive understanding of what bridging an asset means, right? We want to lock up some Bitcoin on the Bitcoin chain, and something happens, and we take it over and use it in dApps as WBTC or TBTC or something else. You might so we want to get the Bitcoin back, so we take it from the dApps and we burn the WBTC or TBTC, and something happens, and we unlock the Bitcoin on the Bitcoin chain. And you might be thinking hey, wait, that's the same shard in reverse. And yeah, it totally is. Bridges are conceptually really, really simple. We just have these two little processes to take this thing from over there and bring it over here, and then do the exact opposite of that. So the part that makes it a bridge is this minting and burning process. And I've represented them here completely independently. The only part that actually connects them is the minting and burning management. The bridge is an application, and we recognize it by its function, which is managing supply of this representational asset. And you might be thinking minting tokens is super easy. Anyone with half a laptop can do that and raise $20 million. And you're right about that. The hard part of the bridge isn't the representation, the token, the application, the minting and burning. It's whether that representation is reliable. And so we kind of got to highlight this magic part here and break it down a little bit. It's not actually magic. It's one-way communication channels. And as I said earlier, the bridge processes are independent. The really important thing to know about a bridge is that it's not like this magical round-trip communication where Bitcoin talks to Ethereum and Ethereum talks to Bitcoin. It's two completely separate one-way communication channels. Bridges are dual simplex. And we get this is old telecoms communication. Telecoms wording for one-way communications. So we have two dual one-way channels, simplex. And duplex channels, which is what we really want, where chains use the same channel to send messages back and forth, are impossible. Dual simplex is literally the best that we can do given the limitations of blockchains. So we've established bridges use two independent, one-way communication channels. And that means that for each leg of the bridge, the minting and the burning, you can use completely separate technologies. And you have to, when you're instantiating a bridge, when you're building this system, choose for each leg separate things. Right. So let's break that down a little more and talk about one-way communications. And I've prepared like two simple examples of how these work, and we'll dive into these. But let's talk about the overarching schema here. This is what we'd like to do. What I kind of wish we could do is just have Bitcoin, the origin chain, send some message to the destination chain and know that it gets there. And I'd like to have it do exactly the same on the way back. Now, unfortunately, blockchains have these kind of trust boundaries. And so you can't just have Ethereum process Bitcoin messages. Ethereum can only process transactions, right? dApps can't just receive messages arbitrarily. We got to send an Ethereum transaction to kick that off. And the same applies to generally to any communication channel. When we're talking about Celo and Cosmos, the Cosmos chain can't inspect Celo and see what's going on. We've got to send a Cosmos transaction with some information to kick off all of that computation and see what happens. So to address this issue, we got to introduce a few more steps into our little flow chart here, right? We'd love to do this, right? We'd love to have Celo dispatch a Cosmos transaction and have Cosmos process that and forward it on to whatever application needs it. And unfortunately, we can't exactly do that either. The Celo chain can't sign a Cosmos transaction. The Celo chain doesn't have private keys and doesn't have an account on the Cosmos hub and doesn't own any atoms. And not being able to have private keys makes it extremely difficult for the Celo chain to own atoms. In fact, blockchains can only affect their own state. It's kind of like a black hole. As you're sending these messages into the chain, they make internal changes within the event horizon of the chain. You can kind of see that and get information out, but they cannot send anything out. Blockchains affect their own state and nothing else, and that makes sending messages really, really difficult. So to address that, we have to introduce a few more steps in the process. We add an off-chain actor who can see both blockchains, and we expect them to make certain to take certain actions to make this bridge work. So we have the sending chain, the origin, commit the message to its own state. It can't send that message onward. It can only commit it. We have the off-chain actor watching for that commitment. It decides whether or not to forward it and dispatches a transaction to Cosmos. Cosmos is going to process that transaction and give the message to the dApp, whatever part of the Cosmos ecosystem wants that incoming message. So the off-chain actor is a necessary element because blockchains are passive. They can only react to things that happen. They can never cause new events to happen. They can update their state. They can't ever update anything about the world outside of themselves. Communications, on the other hand, have to be active. And this means that we need an active off-chain party maintaining the communication channel. It's impossible to run communications between chains without this active off-chain party. And communication taxonomy, the way we think about these channels and the way we interact with them, are determined by the trust model for that party. So how does the communication system constrain the off-chain actor and force them to behave reliably? And we're going to talk a little bit about these trust models. Specifically, we're going to talk about, zooming in on the destination chain here, right? So we've got this transaction processing and the message received by the dApp. we've already established that the origin chain can't make any statement at all about anything that happens after it commits the message. So the origin chain has shouted its message out into the void and is just hoping that something is going to happen and gets no guarantees. And that means that all of these guarantees have to be enforced by the destination chain. So we have to add one more step to our little flowchart here, right? We have to have the destination chain authenticate this message as best it can. And we want to unpack what it means to authenticate messages. If we're going to be checking if this message is good, let's zoom in a bit on this destination chain and try to define what is good. The majority of communication design, all of the engineering work here, the hard parts, are in defining what is a good message on the destination chain. If the sending chain can't make any statements, has no knowledge of anything that's going on with this message, and the off-chain actor is potentially faulty or malicious, how can the destination chain authenticate messages? This ends up being, the vast majority of the design for any cross-chain system, and especially bridges. All right. The question we want to answer is, what makes a message good? If you're Cosmos and you're seeing this incoming message from Celo, or vice versa, or you're Ethereum and you're seeing some incoming message that purports to be from Bitcoin, how do you tell if the message is any good? How do you tell if the message is trustworthy? And, unfortunately, trustworthy is not an engineering concept that we can dump into Solidity. Trustworthy is something that we as humans assess. And what we have to put on chain is what makes a message actionable. At some point, the destination chain has to commit to processing this message. It has to look at it and through a simple, straightforward computation, decide whether it's going to forward it to the dApp involved. And that has to be written down in code and part of the destination chain consensus process. And so we need to set code criteria for this. When the destination chain receives a message, when Cosmos is getting an incoming message from Celo or Bitcoin or Ethereum, what are the concrete programmatic steps that it takes to validate that message? Okay. So we have a few models for this. The first one I'm going to talk about is trusted. We can also think of this as proof of authority. And this is used in the wild a lot by different bridges out there in the world. You can think of WBTC as a proof of authority bridge. The simple instantiation of this is just that I'll send all the messages. I'll sign them all. I'll do it all for you, and you don't need to worry about it at all. And so the destination chain, all it needs to do is check that I sent the message, and it'll accept it and trust it and take action based on it. So proof of authority has a lot of really compelling advantages. First of all, it's me, and I'm inherently trustworthy. All of you can rely on me for anything, anytime, right? So proof of authority, you have fast, cheap, small messages. You can make arbitrary statements. Anything that I am willing to sign can be processed by the destination chain. And the downsides are that there is a single point of failure. If I get hit by a bus or go offline or decide that I want all of your money, you can't stop me from taking it. You can't fix the cross-chain communication channel if I leave. So there's no recourse for you. And the failure mode is that you lose all of your money. All of the money in the bridge becomes worthless. We don't really like that. WBTC has worked in practice, and BitGo has been very reliable about maintaining it and sending Bitcoin where it's supposed to go. But, if that ever changes, WBTC will go from worth 1 BTC to worth nothing immediately. And that's not a comfortable situation. We'd like to do better than that if we can. The other main alternative is relays. A relay runs the origin chain's consensus process inside the destination chain. And if the origin chain consensus says that the transaction is valid, the relay will say that it is valid, and the destination chain can act on it. In practice, you can't execute 100% of Bitcoin's consensus inside Cosmos or inside the EVM. So instead, we use light clients. This is called the SPV assumption, or the SPV method, where SPV stands for Simplified Payment Verification. It's an old Bitcoin term. In practice, what it means is that we follow just the header chain of the sending chain. So in Ethereum, Celo, and Cosmos tracking Bitcoin, this means checking proof of work. When we're trying to inspect Cosmos or get a message from Cosmos, we need to do proof of stake. We need to run an on-chain light client for the remote chain. For proof of work, this is relatively simple. We're going to get a new transaction, and it's going to either be block headers or transactions. For Bitcoin, it's going to be an 80-byte block header, or it's going to be some transaction with a Merkle proof connecting it to a block header. If it is a header, we're going to try to add it to our chain. We're going to check its proof of work. We're going to see if it extends something known to us. And if so, we're going to add it to our store. If it's a transaction, we're going to check if it's in our view of Bitcoin. We've built up this header store, which is a view of Bitcoin's consensus. We want to check and make sure that any transaction is confirmed within that view of Bitcoin's consensus. And from there, we'll see if it contains a message and dispatch it onto the dApp. The authentication step here is checking if our current latest view of Bitcoin's heaviest chain confirms a transaction. And you might notice that that's nearly identical to Bitcoin's own consensus rules. The only place where this fails is if the Bitcoin miners dishonestly confirm invalid transactions. So it is exactly as reliable as the Bitcoin miners are. If you think that 51% of the miners are going to attack the relay, you should not trust it. If you think that's unlikely, then the relay's information is actionable. Bitcoin relays are used actively in TBTC right now, and we built them in Solidity, Rust, and Go to run on Near, Cosmos, Ethereum, Celo, and Solana. So I've worked on these a bunch. I've done at least 5 different implementations of this logic. It takes a lot of time, but proof of work consensus is relatively straightforward and objective. However, it gets a little more complicated when we're dealing with proof of stake. Proof of stake is not objective. It introduces subjectivity. And that means that we can't just sit passively and wait for new headers. It means that we have to keep up with the proof of stake system. So imagine for a second that you're Celo and you're sitting around waiting for messages from Cosmos. And 2/3 of the Cosmos validator set changes, and you never hear about it. How do you know if any new messages are actionable? You cannot determine what the correct validator set is after that occurs. And so where proof of work relays can sit around forever waiting for messages, proof of stake relays need active maintenance. So we introduce what's called a synchrony assumption. we assume that it gets relayed, that it gets updated, that the relay gets updated at least once every n hours. And that synchrony, that time assumption varies based on what remote chain we're trying to track. From there, we can check if the message is signed by our current best known validator set. We update our view of the signer set. So if there's been validator set rotation on Cosmos, we have to write that down inside the Celo state. And then we can update our local view of the remote state and halt. If for any reason that message is delayed, we're going to have to restart the relay. We're building off of a known good state. In a relay, you need this trusted setup of what is a validator set at a specific time. And if you miss your synchrony bound, if you have too few updates and the signer set drifts too much from what your last known good state is, then you need to redo that trusted setup. Your relay is broken and must halt. And this is one of the reasons why proof of stake relays and IBC and other things have taken so long, is we have spent a lot of time optimizing our proof of stake systems for efficient light clients. Tendermint designing with light clients and validator set drift in mind is one of the main innovations that made Cosmos and IBC and efficient proof of stake relays possible. Okay, so going back to our flowchart here, we have the same flow with off-chain actors, but now they can be anyone. Because the information they're relaying is public knowledge, and there's no proof of authority, anyone can take Cosmos headers and send them to Celo, or vice versa. As long as the on-chain relay, the light client, is good, anyone can update it and get correct results, and the chain can have high confidence in taking actions based on those updates. So the advantages here are that it's as good as the remote consensus set again. If the Cosmos validator set is honest and we keep up our synchrony assumption, then this is just as good as running a Cosmos node and validating it entirely directly. We have to assume that the validator set is honest, though. Anyone can participate in the off-chain relay. Anyone can see Cosmos headers and send them to Celo or vice versa. There's no special permissioning required, no trusted party. The major downsides are that there's overhead. In proof of work, we need to send every single header to the other chain. So in Bitcoin, where that happens every 10 minutes, that's fairly low overhead. But in Ethereum, where you have a header every 15 seconds and every header uses a stupid hash function called ethash, it becomes computationally infeasible for the remote chain to process all of those. And this is why ETH1 relays do not exist. Nobody really runs these yet. Near is launching the first one with Rainbow Bridge, and they're using a cool Merkleization trick for ethash to make it computationally feasible. Right. The other downsides of relays are that they require a trusted setup. In proof of work, this can be the genesis block. In proof of stake, it has to be some known good validator set. And in proof of stake, this trusted setup may need to be repeated several times. Okay, so a brief note about sharding while we're here. How does sharding fit into our taxonomy? Sharding really is a relay with shared failures. So if you look at ETH2, you have the beacon chain. It is in phase 1 someday in 2022. It will be relaying the shard chain consensus. and the shard chains will be relaying the beacon chain consensus. The key thing that makes it sharding is these shared failures. If one fails, they all fail. And you roll them all back to a known good state and you do it again. Whereas with a Cosmos Celo relay, if the relay fails, we just keep going. Cosmos doesn't particularly care, Celo doesn't care. We redo that trusted setup to establish the connection again. And what about atomic swaps? Nobody likes them, and we should all stop talking about them forever. Okay, so the last slide I have for you is a brief overview of Cosmos, Celo, and ETH2 and the implementation details for building these relays. I kind of threw this slide together very quickly, and it might have errors, but generally speaking, these are the things that are going to limit relays. ETH2 doesn't support any signature scheme, so it can never check those signatures from other chains. Celo is going to support those signatures in March when we activate a hard fork. We don't yet. We're planning on it, and we're making changes to the consensus system to support it. Cosmos is in a similar position where they will eventually add support for those via Cosmoism, which is very difficult to say, by the way, and I think we need a better name for. And the other core difference is Celo is adding support for Plumo, which is a zero-knowledge proof-based ultra-light client. The idea here being that instead of running the trusted setup for the relay, we can instead provide a short snark proof of the entire history of the Celo chain. And that is better than the trusted setup because it starts from the Genesis block and establishes a cohesive history up to date. So it removes some of the trust from this setup process and makes the penalty of missing your synchrony assumption lower. The downside of Celo here is that the epochs, the validator set elections, are every day. And so we have to do some extra overhead messages when we're not running the Plumo-based sync. Oh, and while we're here, ETH2 having 10,000 plus validators is actually really cool, and we should all talk about that more. All right, that's all my prepared material. It looks like I still have about 5 minutes to read questions. I haven't seen much in chat, so I'm going to go to the question and answer section. Anyone listening, feel free to drop any questions there. So the first question is going back to the very beginning of the talk. Why is duplex impossible? Why can't you establish a communication channel that is two-way between two blockchains? The answer is that chains can only affect their own state. When you send a transaction to Bitcoin, the only thing Bitcoin can do with it ever is update its own state. And that means that you can't have that transaction. The only thing it can do with it ever is update its own state, right? So it can not see the result of any message being sent. It can't observe outside effects like new messages coming in within the same transaction. 4 votes for I'm not up to date. Why does no one like atomic swaps? The answer is that you have a user-facing requirement to run a multi-asset wallet that is specifically engineered to support atomic swaps. So in order to run these, practically speaking, you need to have a user download this wallet, set up the wallet with a new seed phrase, move ETH into it, move Bitcoin into it, or move Cosmos into it, whatever you want to trade, atoms, and then go through some process of matching them with another currently online user and going through this trade that takes several hours to complete. And if either party goes offline during that multi-hour period, they risk losing all of their money. The synchrony and user experience challenges of atomic swaps are much, much, much more difficult to resolve than direct communication-based systems like bridges. Bridges will always, under every circumstance, provide a better experience for the people trying to use it. And this seems to be an intractable problem for atomic swaps. I started working on those in like 2015, and we still haven't made any significant advancements. We've made them more complicated, we've added more bells and whistles, and we have discovered that nobody uses them. The main movement there is in shifting them to layer 2, which might have some benefits, but it is unclear whether it will beat out other layer 2 solutions that aren't atomic. Okay, next question is why a trusted setup is needed for proof of stake. If the Genesis committee is trusted, all the subsequent committees can be verified by the light client, right? Yes and no. In a proof of stake system, you trust the Genesis committee until you get the next committee. And then you trust that one until you get the next one. Whereas in a relay that's running this retrospectively, they don't have that synchrony assumption. They haven't been following along this entire time. And so if the main chain is on epoch 5000 and the relay starts at epoch 1, the Genesis committee could, 5,000 epochs later in real chain time, sign a new message, creating a different epoch 2. The Genesis committee can now, because it's 5,000 epochs later, lie about epoch 2. And they can lie directly to the relay. And that means that the relay, because it has not been online this whole time, can be fooled without penalty for the people trying to scam it. So the relay needs this synchrony assumption. It needs to follow along with each epoch as it occurs. And it needs this synchrony assumption to know that the incoming messages are slashable on the remote chain. All right, I think that's every question.
Cool.
And we're right on time.
All right, we're going to transition to our next session now. Thanks again.
Bye, everyone.